Good afternoon and good evening and good morning, everybody, wherever you are. It is great to be with you. My name is Etienne van der Walt from Neurozone. I have been working with Neurozone for a number of years now, and as a neurologist have been involved in the clinical aspects and the research, the development of the behavioral code for Neurozone, and also looking at the content of what we deliver from a neuroscientific perspective to Neurozone. Neurozone being a neuroscience and analytics company, really all concerned about enhancing performance. So we're all about high performance through building resilience and, of course, preventing burnout through that. Now, having said that, I'm here today to really speak to you about a very interesting and in fact not the same condition, but about compassion fatigue. And I'm going to talk to you about compassion fatigue, also comparing it a bit to burnout and seeing how can we distinguish between the two conditions. And let's talk about the importance of compassion fatigue, of course. So, and then I also want to really look a bit at the brain and see if we can discover a few things about the brain, how the brain works with compassion, how the brain works with empathy, and how does this all work for us in the context of staying alive, surviving, and thriving in life and in the workplace. And then at the end, I will speak to you a little bit about the way that empathy and compassion develops from early childhood development's perspective, and then how can we treat and prevent compassion fatigue. So, of course, just to remind you, a logistic, if you do have any questions or thoughts that you want to share with us, there is a Q&A section. If you just look at the bottom horizontal bar of the screen of your Zoom interface here, you'll see that you'll find Q&A in the center. Just click there and just add your questions and thoughts there. Albert is fantastic in the background. He's going to assist me from the back end, and he's going to present the questions a few at a time, since we've been dealing with numbers of questions in the last tutorials and the master classes. So we'd love to keep the order fine, and I really hope to get to all the questions. So let me get going with compassion fatigue and the master class today. I'm going to share a screen with you. So we just open this up. And so, what is compassion fatigue? Now, I've been working in very busy hospital settings, clinics, and practices, seeing many very ill patients, neurological patients, very often extremely depressing because of the nature of the condition, and also the absolute difficulties of treating these patients. And very often you simply can't do anything but inform and prognosis being presented, and then support these patients. So it's very tough to actually continuously, day in and day out, actually work with these patients. And of course, continuously having to have empathy and compassion with our patients. And so compassion fatigue is something that's very common in the world of healthcare, in the world of dealing with trauma. And so you'll also see that it's on the rise in the amongst lawyers. And so it's where lawyers work with traumatized patients and conditions where they actually have to deal with these traumatic events. We also see that it's rising, and I'll explain that in a second, because of what's happening in the world today. So it's also called vicarious traumatization, and here you can see it. It's secondary traumatization. So effectively, our brains are being affected by this experience of what we are seeing in the lives of others in front of us, and which we then witness and then actually assimilate into our own system. So, and of course, the the emotional residue, and it says here exposure to working with those suffering with the consequence of traumatic events, it differs from burnout, right? So we're going to speak about burnout just in a second. It can, of course, coexist because burnout is a different condition, which we will also just remind ourselves about in a second. But there are many different ways that compassion fatigue can actually creep up on us. I think what is important about compassion fatigue, as it is with burnout, is that you don't just wake up one morning and you're basically completely burnt out or completely fatigued. It's a process that slowly develops over time. It's a chronic process, and you will see that compassion fatigue is actually developing quicker. It takes less time to develop than burnout, but it also recovers quicker. So it's less, if you may, deeper condition. It's easier to recover from, and as it is with burnout, which of course, or as with burnout, that is really a deeply seated, and pretty much saying what it is, burnt out condition where the brain-body system is imploding, and takes a long time to recover from this state of a long-term chronic stress. So back to compassion fatigue. Who gets it? And we just said healthcare professionals, caregivers, mental health professionals. You can see the list there: critical care personnel. There are many others, of course. And as I said, the new kid on the block, if you may, with all due respect, the lawyers. So many of these traumatic events now being witnessed and dealt with by lawyers as well. Now, maybe just one very important point to make. There is something else happening in the world today, and this is that we are witnessing way more trauma and severely traumatizing events across the globe because of our interconnectedness and because of the social media and the fact that we are so connected to every piece of news. And so the news that comes our way, that we are exposed to on a daily basis, is way more than what our brains primitively have been used to deal with. And so the idea that you and I, not being necessarily being healthcare professionals, but actually, or one of these professions, can also develop compassion fatigue because of just a continuous bombardment and exposure to the pain in the world. And so pain and grief in the world and suffering in the world becomes an incredibly prevalent and extremely burdening part of our lives, which we were not necessarily supposed to experience at this kind of level. Now, compared to compassion fatigue, please just for a moment sit with me and think about burnout. Now, burnout is a cumulative process of emotional exhaustion. And so you can see the difference. Emotional exhaustion, and also, of course, people become cynical. They withdraw. They become, they actually dissociate from the work, or they are just very exhausted and overwhelmed because of the increased workload. And it's workload-based. And it's interesting, it's also said institutional stress, but there's chronic stress and workload that is continuously just too much. And I perceive that I can't overcome these challenges. And therefore my system just, there's a stress response that is evoked in the system. And this chronic stress then eventually lead to this condition called burnout. Now, resilience, for example, prevents against burnout. Remember that there's a common factor here, and that is stress. So burnout as a result of chronic stress and compassion fatigue, and let me go back one, compassion fatigue is a result of what is called secondary traumatic stress. So we also develop a stress response, a continuous stress response in the brain due to these continuous traumatization. And so compassion fatigue as a result of secondary traumatic stress, and then chronic stress resulting in the workplace, resulting in burnout. Now, I'm sure you're going to ask me now, hey, how do I actually distinguish between these two conditions? Is there a way that if somebody sits in front of me, that I can distinguish between burnout and compassion fatigue? The answer is it's actually not easy. There's a gray area here. And as we said, it very often coexists. And then there's comorbidity, if you may, means that the individual now becoming a client, became a patient, now actually has got a has even got less reserves to work with and develop illness and dysfunction easier. So the idea that you want to distinguish between these two are fairly important. So let's look at ways of distinguishing between them. If you look at compassion fatigue, the first thing is that there has to be a trauma relatedness about it. Of course, you're going to say, well, what about people who are just continuously exposed to these traumatic events and tragedies in the world? They're not necessarily healthcare workers. They're not necessarily critical care workers and mental health workers, lawyers and other people who deal with trauma on a daily basis in their workplace, but they deal with trauma on a daily basis in life. And so that is true. It is not that simple. But by and large, there is very often a very strong trauma-related exposure. There's an overexposure to trauma. In burnout, it's workplace overload. So you basically just have too much coming your way. And of course, in this rapidly evolving world, this interconnected world, you can see that they have different kind of challenges that it poses for us. So the idea of workplace overload leading to burnout, secondary trauma-related relatedness leading the trauma-related stress leading to compassion fatigue. As I said before, compassion fatigue, shorter time to onset, and it has a quicker recovery. So it's as if it's not that deep and hard to recover from. Whereas burnout is a deeply and a profound condition that needs longer time to recover, a longer time to develop, but also has a slower recovery. You could probably even say that compassion fatigue is more acute in the sense that it comes on quicker, so it effectively unravels the condition very quickly and then recovers very quickly. It's a bit like an acute infection that just comes and goes in a matter of hours or days. Whereas something else becomes deep, it actually just completely creeps into your system, continues, and then over time, it leads to your condition. And then it's a deeply seated, more a chronic type of condition. I hope that makes sense. And of course, as we said, what the way that compassion fatigue also presents itself is that people feel very burdened. They feel overburdened, and emotionally they express, I'm burdened by traumatic events. It's just too much for me. There's just too much of this traumatic events in my life. And of course, that can lead to a number of things, including lack of sleep and irritability and all kinds of things that now become very non-specific. Because as you know, that you see that in burnout as well. But as opposed to this burdened by traumatic events in burnout, cynical, and people become cynical. They've got cynicism about the workplace. They are detached. They become disengaged, and they're also overwhelmed by their workload as opposed to burdened by traumatic events. These are helpful components that you can use when you speak to your client, and your client is in this specific situation. How do you actually differentiate between them? Now, this is a very busy slide, but I thought I want to share this with you simply also because, you know, we're about the science and we're about interesting ways that people actually structure their thought process and model ideas around it. Simply what you see here is, by the way, with all this, we acknowledge Figley's work on this. This is not original from Neurozone, but I've lent this from Figley. What you have is there's, first of all, an empathic ability. We have the capacity for empathy, and that's actually the process that goes wrong, right? And it's overburdened, which eventually leads to, on the far right, to compassion fatigue. So effectively, there's exposure to suffering. There's an empathic response. And this concern that continuously we actually build this empathic response into once again overcome that, and we should actually move back into this relaxed state, the relaxed physiological state, if everything works well. But if it's continuously and there's a prolonged exposure, we will not more have any sense of satisfaction anymore, but there will be detachment, a residual compassion stress, and the traumatic memories plus prolonged suffering then leads to compassion fatigue. There are also other life demands that enhances, as we said, enhances accelerates the process of developing compassion fatigue. Now, having said that, I just want to sit back for a moment and think with you, because what we've done now is we've sort of said, okay, what is compassion fatigue, and where does it come from? Who gets it? What does it look like? How does it actually differ from burnout? How does it develop? And now we probably want to probe a bit deeper, right? So I would love to actually have a look into the brain with you, look at a few components. Of course, we can't go into the depths of the brain. There's no time in 20 minutes that we have, or maybe even less, to speak about the brain. But let me try to just share with you a few very interesting thoughts with you. The first thing that you see there when you think about compassion, and we often talk about empathy and compassion in the same sentence, and the reason is because they are very related. In fact, compassion is a form of empathy, and I'm going to just say a few words about that as well now. What you see here are individuals actually having a very, actually an interaction where there is mirroring. There's a transfer of information, and then in my brain, I actually develop a representation of what goes on in yours. And so I make an internal representation of the condition that you are in due to my understanding of what is going on in your mind, in your emotion, and in your life. And for that, I need, it's very complex. I need to actually be able to understand the human condition. I need to understand the human condition from a perspective of a number of perspectives, not only the perspective of how you think, but how you feel, and also why you feel and think, called the theory of mind, when you think about why you think and feel. And also, so all of these components come to play when we actually internalize what's going on in somebody else's life, and it becomes a little part of me. In fact, for a moment, you become a little you in me, for me, so that I can actually deal with that you in me, and deal appropriately to be in a collective where we collaborate and where we help each other in life, something we do as human beings, which I find fascinating, and potentially the reason, or plausible reason, for why we exercise this looking after our disabled members in our society, which we do with great effort today. I mean, with great efficacy today, and we actually apply that energy to do it, so that we most likely, so that it builds compassion and empathy, which is so essential for collective creativity in such a rapidly evolving world today. And so looking after the disabled, looking after people with chronic illness, looking after people is becoming increasingly important. And what we are talking about is this looking after the people through compassion, just being overburdened, leading to compassion fatigue. So you can just we can go on and on, but what you see here is a mirroring, a mirror of one to the other that is forming. Before we get to mirror neurons, I'm sure you've heard the mirror and thought about that. I actually want to share a few thoughts with you about how cognitive and effective empathy develops. Now, this is quite a busy slide, but before we think about that, let's just first consider the idea of empathy. What is empathy? I mean, how do you categorize it? And so usually we simplify it at Neurozone. We just basically talk about cognitive empathy and effective empathy, and you can see it here. If you go and look deeper, you'll see that there are a number of different ways of classifying empathy. One of them would be cognitive, another one would be emotional empathy. That's where I feel in your shoes, but I'm actually not doing anything about it. I sense what you feel and how your emotion, and I can actually stand next to you and actually feel that. But when I'm driven to do something about it and to help you, that's compassion. And so there's emotional empathy, there's compassion, and then of course there are other forms of empathy as well. One of them called somatic empathy, when I can actually feel the pain. If you have physical pain, I can feel physical pain in my body. I remember, as just on a personal note, how I often drove back home after a busy day, seeing many patients with many different dysfunctions, and I would feel some of these symptoms in my body, which is a somatic type of empathy. And then finally, there's also now spiritual empathy, talking about the connectedness with a greater conscious or greater consciousness and interconnectedness. A lot of these terminologies now used for this, what we call spiritual component of interconnectedness, the sense of being connected with everyone and every thing in the cosmos. But let's stick to this idea that cognitive and effective empathy really is an easier way to just look at it. And effective speaks to, I feel in your shoes, and compassion means I feel in your shoes and I'm compelled to help you because I feel your pain and your loss, and I share my ice cream with you if you've lost your ice cream, and I see you crying and I experience that sense of loss, and I'm compelled to help and reduce your sense of loss. And that is a compassion within this realm of effective empathy. Cognitive empathy, a different type of empathy, which is not that well known by everyone. But as you know, we talk about this very frequently at Neurozone. So important. I think in your shoes so that I understand where you're coming from. I understand the perspective from where you're coming from. And of course, theory of mind, which is something that's being developed in the playground, and I'll get to that in a second, provides me with the understanding of why you do say what you say and why you do what you do. This is all part of something called mentalization. It's the process in the brain that's mentalizing and understanding, making an internal representation that needs to be accurate enough so that my system can actually respond appropriately and connect with yours, and we can all then collaborate as a collective, which enhances, as you know, the yield and reduce the energy that we need to assign to achieve our tasks, which effectively is then accomplished with good leadership. Focus on a vision, low energy, high yield, the gestalt, if you may, the complex system, the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts, etc. And so this is at the core of it, and it needs to develop properly. And if it's, as we said, if you overuse and continuously overuse your compassionate part of this empathy, you develop compassion fatigue, as opposed to burnout. I hope that makes more and more sense to as we continue to just process our thoughts aloud a bit. Now, looking at this busy slide that I'm sure you sort of got used to now, and you wonder what is going on here. On the far left-hand side here, you will see that this is the early childhood. It's around the age of 3 years and a little bit more, where a child develops really a strong effective empathy, that the capacity for emotional empathy and effective empathy. The first thing is that a mother-child interaction is critical. So somebody with strong effective empathy had good synchrony in their mother-child relationship. If you think about mother, think organic mother, don't think biological mother necessarily. Very seldomly, the organic mother is, or the organic mother is not the biological mother, but it doesn't. It's still it's that synchrony between the mother and the child that is so important. This is one of the reasons we are very clear about it when we think about early childhood development, that if you have children in a preschool, that those children really develop in 3 different scenarios. One is on their own, where they continue to explore. 2 is they develop in their peer groups, together in groups, where they develop this theory of mind and role play and all kinds of things. But they do develop on the lap of the caregiver as well. And so that's where the mother-child interaction is continuously then extended into the preschools, and it's critical for that kind of interaction to take place, that synchrony of a caregiver with a child on the caregiver's lap. I'm sharing this with you because it's helpful to understand where this effective empathy and compassion capacity comes from. And of course, then the second one is this: the child develops an emotional reactivity with that, and the way that continues to develop provides the way forward for cultivating this capacity for effective empathy. Later in childhood, the mother-child interaction also has an effect, but you can see that what you see when you think about these kind of conditions that develop later in childhood, you'll see that there are conditions that can start to develop, and I'm not exactly sure what that particular interaction in psychiatric diagnosis means. I'm going to leave that for a second. What I actually want to jump to is right to the final brain here. And you can see that what happens here is that there are two forms of empathy networks. And the first network is this orange one. You can see them there, and they are really, and then there's a shared component here in the brain. This is where effective empathy is actually situated. And if you look at the blue, you'll see that's where cognitive empathy expresses itself in the brain when you do functional MRI studies. If you actually flip the brain around, you'll see that there's more a cognitive empathy sort of activity in the outside of the brain, and then in the internal so-called medial part of the brain, you'll see more of the effective empathy networks. It's actually it makes a lot of sense because, and I'm going to remind you now about the Neurozone model of brain performance, how the internal, the sort of middle bit in the internal side, the so-called ventromedial part, has to do with the emotional components, with a sense of belonging, with the capacity for attention, and for emotional response. Whereas the external component of the brain, this external part, outer layers, are more important for problem solving, really focusing on learning, using knowledge, and really taking those knowledge and abstracting it into potential realistic scenarios of the possible. So you can actually see how that develops. And so what you see here is that in the very early childhood interactions, the effective empathy developing in the orange. And then, of course, as you get older, cognitive empathy starts to develop and build. And you also see this in the blue part. Now, this picture is a known picture that we use in Neurozone, especially for our certified coaches. You will recognize this when you think about collective creativity as this important driver of building collaborative networks for high yield. And you'll remember that we talk about this very often, that there's a role play that takes place amongst children. There's two builders sitting here, and then all kinds of other people at play, playing certain roles, and then they swap around, and then there are even dogs and cats, etc., etc. The idea of role play is that they develop theory of mind, which is why do you actually do things the way you do it? And it's part of cognitive empathy, critical to develop that, as we know. So empathy, effective empathy, very early in your development stages, cognitive empathy a little bit later, but then it continues throughout. And this is what underpins our capacity for collaboration. And just if you look at this brain again here, you'll see a fascinating picture. Do you see this part here, the left side? This brain is the outer part of the brain. This is the inner part. Maybe you should just trust me for that because it's not that clear to see. But this is the outer part of the brain. Remember, we talked about this outer part of the brain, which is this red little dot here, so-called salience network, the network that is actually activated when there's pain. It's activated to solve during cognitive empathy to solve problems. And this part, the inner part, is the part that is actually important for effective empathy. So you can see that the brain in this part, as well as the inner part of the brain, has continuously work with these two forms of empathy and with compassion and with the capability for solving problems and keeping us together so that we can actually have a high yield. Now, let me just for a moment talk about this idea of mirror neurons. If you look at this particular neuron, these are neurons that actually are neural networks that start to oscillate and develop and form their networks based on the internalization of what we see outside of us, and especially when it comes to the emotional context and context of what is happening in people's faces, in their lives, in their expressions. And then we have a network that starts to fire that is synchronized with that particular part of the brain of the individual who expresses this. And so mirror neurons can actually be found in specific parts of the brain. I'm actually showing you this not because it's of importance to understand where they are, but it is it's really of use to understand that they are really there. And so there's been a long debate as to whether there are mirror neurons or not. Do they exist? Do they not exist? In a sense, it's a bit I would say, technical, it's academic. Uh, there is such a thing as mentalization and mirroring of another, and it is a physical process, whether it is due to frequencies or due to particular networks. We currently believe that there are networks in these areas that actually do function as mirror neurons. And you can see, once again, they are in the outer surface of the brain here, the human mirror neuron system. We even internalize pain. When we talk about empathy and compassion, we also internalize the pain of others in the same areas where we actually experience pain ourselves. So remember that you can actually feel physical pain and psychological pain in the same areas of the brain. We also feel that pain when I see that you have pain. I actually have activation in very similar areas in my brain. The self and others. You see self and other, and there you see self and other. And it's in these areas. It's actually in these little blobs there and that blob down there. If you look at it from the front, and this is from the side. Very useful to understand how we mirror these particular emotions. So having said this, what have we done now? We've looked at a number of interesting notions about how the brain physically deals with empathy and compassion. It's critical. It is so important. There's so much that is really devoted in the brain to ensure that we work together as collectives, that we have the glue that glue us together, that gives us a sense of belonging and bonding at the bottom line, at the level of social safety. When you think about effective empathy, if you think about compassion, that it's essential to actually look after one another and ensure that we carry the burden together, that we reduce the load for individuals, because it's not possible to survive on our own. And you can also see how cognitive empathy builds the glue that actually binds, actually glue us together so that we can solve our problems properly and actually have an understanding and internalize and allow each other to change one another through our thoughts, perceptions, to understand what you are thinking, but also where it's coming from and why you're thinking that, which is the theory of mind idea. So you can see we've sort of built a number of little constructs around that to emphasize its importance. Back to compassion fatigue. So compassion fatigue is an overused, a very, very important instrument or machinery, piece of machinery in the brain-body system, which people overuse when they continue to express compassion in their brains, the brain and neural circuits that actually start to fire, that relate to the pain of the other, starts to fire, and it can actually be so bad that it can be somatic, that you can even experience the physical pain and the symptoms. And in time, the system just continues to fire and develops what's called a secondary traumatic stress response, and then starts to become more fatigued because the energy that is assigned is just too much. And so that results in compassion fatigue. Of course, dysfunction because of that as well, lower performance and so on. And so how do we treat compassion fatigue? Well, I drew this from a great article, and this is ways of treating compassion fatigue. It looks a bit non-specific, but let me just share this with you. Enhance the awareness with education. The first important thing about compassion fatigue is to understand what it is and that it exists. And so for you as coaches and healthcare workers, if you work with trauma, please be aware of this, understand it, have a self-awareness about it. And that in itself already, as you know, helps to prevent you going into that sort of downward spiral and to recognize when this is actually becoming too much. Accept where you are on your path at all times. This is interesting. These are experts who work in this field who recommend an acceptance, a self-acceptance, and then, of course, exchange information and feeling with people who can validate you. The idea that you don't, in an isolated fashion, just have a mirroring every day with trauma, but actually have a very clear connectedness with others, talk about share other thoughts and feelings, share your thoughts and feelings about your experiences, but also get validation of the value you contribute. And then clarify your own personal boundaries. These are all very non-specific, if you may, soft but very important components. Be kind to yourself, express what you need, and take positive action to change your environment. I think it's worthwhile for coaches to understand this and to really, these are things you can actually share with your clients. if they work in the healthcare environment or as lawyers. It looks like very soft components, if you may, or very the soft skills that we need to develop. Critical because it actually works in the physical realm in the brain. And you're of course welcome to take screenshots of these particular slides. There's a way to prevent it. Limiting the amount of daily news you watch or read about. We talked about that, right? So the idea that we are exposed to this trauma continuously, let's be careful about that and try to come to terms with the fact that pain and suffering are realities of life, which we have little or no control over. So it's a mindset again. Work on our mindset about how we think about pain and suffering, and be grateful for what is good in life. Focus on that, and then try to find meaning in the suffering we see. Once again, it's a way of mindset. Is why did this happen? Why is it? It gives us a certain perspective. And of course, the rest is self-explanatory. You can just take a screenshot if you want of these. I want to share a final idea with you. Just a very fascinating assessment score that I want to just alert you to. And this is the particular URL. Once again, that I want to, if you can just make a screenshot of this particular website or web page. This is a self-assessment, a quality of life, compassion fatigue self-assessment that has been developed by Dr. Beth Handel-Stam. And she's one of an authority in compassion fatigue. And it's quite useful. I had a look at it myself, and I think that's something that you might actually want to use. So if you just want to have, I'll leave this for a second, so you can just do your screenshots. And so it's that PROQOL is professional quality of life. And it's a self-score report in English. There are also different languages there. If you actually click, you'll see that there are many different languages in which you can actually find this particular assessment. And this is just a little extract, a screenshot of the assessment. It looks at your compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue itself. And then you can actually self-score yourself. And then eventually it gives you a score on compassion satisfaction, even on burnout, and then secondary traumatic stress. And then it says your compassion satisfaction has to be very high, your secondary compassion stress has to be low. And then burnout as another component that they're measuring. And so once you've completed that, you can actually download this, have a look, and complete and see if it works for you, if you want to use it with some of your clients to see if they have compassion fatigue or not. I'm going to, at this point, go to the questions and answer session, and let's see if we can deal with a few interesting remarks and thoughts about this particular topic. Okay, thanks, Albert. Here we go. Fantastic. Can enhancing resilience reduce the effects of compassion fatigue? That's such a good question. I was actually thinking about this. And then I really started thinking about, and I'm going to share this with you because the first thing is I haven't seen studies that has very explicitly demonstrated this, especially because resilience as well is such it's not a new field, but it's a really revived field, and therefore in that sense a lot of things happening at the moment in resilience, really working at preventing burnout in the workplace as a result of chronic stress, and also setting us up for high performance. And of course, as you know, that's where we work from a Neurozone perspective. And that's why resilience is such an important component. What is resilience? Let's for a moment just say what resilience is. It's an innate neurobiological capacity that you and I express every single day in every single cell of our bodies. It means that we have prior knowledge of different scenarios in life that can be challenging. And once there's a challenging scenario, or we perceive a challenge coming our way, we make a prediction of what that's going to do, because we have knowledge. We use the prior knowledge, and then we actually then we take our energy and assign energy very appropriately. It has to be to overcome a challenge, and to actually, or to change our ways so that we can actually be where we want to be in the future. That's really with how complex problem solving works, but also effectively how I build a muscle when I gym. So it's at a very rudimentary, primitive, but also at a high level, very much a feature of every single part of our brain body system. That's part of what that makes up a complex adaptive system. And so if you think about compassion fatigue, I would assume that it should have an effect. I don't think that it works in that axis completely. My thoughts are that if you continue to, if you have high resilience, it will not necessarily prevent compassion fatigue, but it will reduce its effects, and it will take longer to develop, simply because I find ways to continuously overcome the challenge that is in front of me. And that challenge is this trauma, the secondary traumatic event. So if there's a secondary traumatic event in my brain, my resilience capacity, try to overcome this trauma, try to overcome it with a variety of different, if you may, skills and mechanisms. And then once it's overcome it then removes it. And so I think yes, but I'm not actually 100% sure about it. Thank you for that question. I think, though, as well, maybe just one more comment about resilience is that I think what we really need to cultivate, and this has also been, I think we find that from the treatment and prevention of compassion fatigue, we understand that there are particular components that you and I have to think about. We have to have a certain transformation of our mindset around how we view trauma, how we view trauma in the world, and also then reduce our exposure to that, and how we can reduce the exposure. Right. So, and those are, of course, solutions to the challenge and the problem, which comes from a resilient thinking system. Everything affects everything. Now, compassion fatigue, does the list extend to social workers, therapists, and maybe coaches? Absolutely, no doubt. I mean, I just listed a number of the most important ones that have been studied, and of course, as you can understand. But if you think about social workers, undoubtedly. If you think about therapists and even maybe coaches, maybe coaches, I thought about this just before the masterclasses. I wonder if any study has been done on coaches. I suppose it depends on what you are coaching and who you are coaching. I mean, if you coach people who are disabled, for example, or have had really traumatic events, and you're working through logotherapy, not only to fix them through therapy, but actually logotherapy to help them achieve their desired goals, there is a chance. I would assume, though, that the closer you are to the cold face of trauma, people who have been traumatized, the higher your chance of developing compassion fatigue. Then on that note, what about police, emergency responders? Absolutely, yeah, totally. So so these are the emergency workers, if you may. They are critical care workers, but emergency workers who really work in the face of death. Police, undoubtedly. Emergency responders. I mean, firemen, they often, as you know, when I remembered the real broken people and bodies at serious accident scenes, they are often brought to the hospital and the morgues by firemen. It's a very, very tough environment. So they are really traumatized very often by this and has to be debriefed properly. The military, say no more. So these are acute traumatic events. I have to say, though, that there's a difference between post-traumatic stress syndrome and compassion fatigue. So compassion means that you actually are compassionate with people and you help. And if you have acute events like in the military, you have things happening continuously bombs falling, people dying. This is where you think post-traumatic stress. It's a trauma. That kind of trauma is a different kind of trauma. Whereas with compassion fatigue, you have time to really internalize the process of trauma, the process of illness, the process of death, the process of cancer patients dying. And so you can see there is a difference between compassion fatigue and post-traumatic stress, for example, depending on how that traumatic event presents itself in time and its acuteness, etc. Can compassion fatigue affect parents of a child with mental health challenges? Yeah, I'm pretty convinced it can. Eh? I mean, it has to. I think these are all questions that the answer to it has to be yes. And it depends, of course, on the degree of involvement, which we know parents are highly likely to be very involved with their children with mental health challenges, and they often feel very unable to really deal appropriately. They always wonder if they're doing the right things, and of course, in time, that can lead to a compassion fatigue. I haven't seen numbers on this, and so I can only say yes, I think so. But I think from ground principles, if you think about what it is and what brings it on and how it develops, you can probably guess this with me and make a good educated guess about it. Regarding genocide, when people disassociate individuals as humans and treat them as objects, prisons, Holocaust, etc., etc. Right. So this is not a compassion fatigue, but this is probably a form of what we call cognitive empathy that is used for evil means. So people who understand the human condition, but actually don't have any sense of right and wrong and the morality around that. And so it sort of starts to speak to a psychopathic type of nature. But we've seen that people in general, when you start to move into one direction, you can even continuously blunt yourself in terms of not compassion necessarily, but get blunted around what is right and wrong. And that is a different kind of, that is not the same as compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue means that you start to dissociate from this. You don't become dispassionate. You reduce your compassion is lowered, but you don't become blunted into so blunted that you actually have a pathological idea of what is right and wrong. That's not the case. So I think it's got to be differentiated. But once again, these complex things of how this develops in the brain is something that is a mystery to us. And so there must be some kind of overlap there. I just don't understand that. What is the relationship? What is the relationship between emotional intelligence and compassion fatigue? Yeah, so I think question of emotional intelligence. What is emotional intelligence? There's so much happening today in terms of the way we think about these constructs. So EQ, speaking about self-awareness and understanding, and that self-application, and the way we delay gratification, and and then you think spiritual intelligence, also talking about self-awareness, and then leading into interconnectedness of everything, having a sense of your place in the world, and purpose, and so forth. Those components all play a very important role, I think. In fact, if you look at what is being said by the experts to prevent compassion fatigue, it is about self-awareness and awareness of when certain things start to happen in my system. It is about purpose, a sense of purpose. It is about enough awareness to be able to shift my mindset about how I think about trauma, and so you can actually see how that all plays a part. So the answer is yes, and I think many of our coaches who work with healthcare workers, especially doctors and healthcare professionals, we have many coaches working in that space. It's really important to understand how to continue to cultivate this with your clients. Talking about the human mirror system, is this also connected to the way we see the world or manifest our circumstances? Often how we feel or the faults we see in others, we recognize in others and criticize others for the same thing because it's a trait and we don't like it in ourselves. That's quite a mouthful. Maybe just one thought about that. So I think what you referred to here is the way we internalize the world is based upon our frame of the world. It's a belief system, it's a mindset, it's a worldview. You can give it different names, and they all sort of overlap. But that way we see the world and we view others and circumstances is based on the way we assign values to those incoming cues. And so very complex summation our brains make multimodally within complete split seconds is how we then assign values to incoming cues and says, this is how important this is for my survival, and I've got to go here, and then it guides me through life safely. Now that process is based on the internal representation of what is out there, which has been formed over even the ages through our ancestors, then my own upbringing, and then I reinforce this by dreaming and only reinforcing what I actually believe is important for my survival. This is not the case with human mirror systems. In fact, it is part of that, because a human mirror system mirrors what it actually mirror an emotional contagion. It's an emotional part of, it's an emotional expression. It is the way somebody reacts and responds to particular cues. So certain emotional, the way that those feelings are expressed, which says something about the emotion. And that is contagious. It's called the emotional contagion, and that goes right into the system and is internalized and experienced by the brain in certain neural networks, so that we can actually have the same sensations, the same feeling, the same emotional response, the same pain. And so I can actually have compassion, and that prompts me to actually do something about the pain, or if there is pain, so I can actually deal with that. You can see how that works. That's a different kind of construct than internal representations, which speaks to mindset, worldview, and belief system. But thank you for such a very important question. As opposed to fatigue, can you explain how meditation and mindfulness builds compassion and wisdom? So meditation and mindfulness is still a mystery in so many ways, but it's a really important and so profound. I actually view, if I think about it from a simplistic perspective and more metaphoric, of mindfulness and silencing the mind on a daily basis as a process that really is the oil for the whole system, for the whole problem-solving machine. It's the oil. You can fuel it with nutrition and with sleep and fuel everything, and you can fuel it with gratitude, and you can fuel it with curiosity and ensure that you have a self-worth and a mood state. But the oil for the machine goes right through, from basic to sophisticated. It works right across the whole, what we call the neural axis of creativity. It ensures that downstream the whole body is in the baseline relaxed physiological state. It then ensures that the brain continues to enhance its capacity, so that functional capacity, so that the prefrontal cortex is in control and regulates everything. It reduces the amygdalas and grows the capacity for learning. So it just continuously builds the system. It oils it all, and then it just grows this brain in the right direction for complex problem solving and for innovation. And so in that sense, meditation and mindfulness, if you think about wisdom, it also provides us, by the way, just with a capacity to connect more and more cues that we don't necessarily know about. And so the more I connect cues that are out there that I don't actually see unless I am more and more mindful, and that's very often unconscious, I start to see cues that provides me with a capacity for understanding the interconnectedness of everything, and of course the capacity for being really innovative about where we are going and the greater scheme of things. And we start to model the gestalt. Now that speaks to wisdom, right? And so we can understand how mindfulness does that. Compassion in that sense as well, because it provides us with more cues. In the same way that I can actually connect more cues and be more innovative about how to build a computer, I'm also more innovative about how can I actually pick up more cues and emotional nuances of people and actually be more appropriate in my response towards their needs. So I hope that explains that question, at least from the perspective that I have. There are many, I'm sure there are many more perspectives on this. Are there industries or micro audiences you would like to see more data collected and conversations initiated on this topic? For example, parents raising kids with learning disabilities. Parents raising kids with learning disabilities, dyslexia, ADHD, also digitally overwhelmed adults who are silently struggling with their invisible learning disabilities from comorbid chronic health conditions, chemo, brain, low thyroid, menopause. Massive. That's a massive question. I'm not sure where this is coming from. It's the answer to it, of course, is yes. Yes, we want to see more. And of course, I think we will see more. This is a field that is on the rise. That's why we really choose these topics. We look at them and see what are really really important topics that we need to emphasize and talk about and become more aware about as professionals in the world of high performance and of organizational well-being for high performance. And you can imagine in organizations, all of these things you mentioned, people who work in organizations have these kind of problems, and it's prevalent. And so if you want to really build a high performance organization, you have to understand these conditions and to know about them. And we need to start to actually develop our understanding and start to quantify, not only quantify these conditions. So yes, I think it is really important, and I think it's coming. It's just a question of time and continuous collective awareness. And this is how we will roll in the future, right? We start to refine the way that we thrive in life, which is quite exciting. Are there research to suggest links between certain personality types like feeling and compassion fatigue? I was thinking about that, and in fact, I didn't Google it. So if you want to have a look and maybe look at, I often just, when I do a search, I would put in scholarly articles for this and look for any of these connections. But I'll have a look at that. My apologies, I actually didn't search for that. Intuitively, one would wonder if that is the case indeed, that people who are more feeling, have more a feeling operational style could actually develop compassion fatigue sooner and easier. But I'm not sure about this, right? Because these are all crude instruments. And so, yeah, interesting. Thank you. Sorry that I can't answer that question properly. I'm going to answer another question. On the note of genocide, what about social justice warriors, for example, the left in America who claim to fight for human rights, but whose emotions cloud the judgments of facts? Oh, this is a tough question. It looks quite political. Let me just go back on this. On the note of genocide, what about social justice warriors, for example, the left in America, who claim to fight for human rights, but whose emotions cloud their judgments or facts? You haven't lost the connection. I'm just thinking about this. So, I'm not sure that compassion fatigue plays a role here. I think that this must be some other constructs, and I think we will be extremely silly to try to explain every single construct and behavioral patterns and certain emotional movements in the world with one particular subject, such as compassion fatigue. I don't know, I suppose, would be my best answer. I think that there are many other components at play that might cloud my own scientific judgments on this question. I'm sorry that I can't answer that question properly. And I think that's all we have time for. It is 18:31. Thank you very much for joining. Such an interesting topic, and I'm really looking forward to see you again in the new year. We will let you know when the next masterclass will be. Have a wonderful festive season, rest well, and enjoy your family and loved ones, and be sure that you look after yourselves and be kind to yourselves as well. You worked very hard, as we all did, and we all need to pay real attention to our brain-body systems and be mindful about this wonderful instrument and machine that we have to look after so properly. I really wish you a wonderful time. Until next year, goodbye.